Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. This is Xanthus with Xanthus Gaming. We're here in Diablo 3 on the closed beta for the Necromancer. And we're going to go ahead and show you some of the builds for the Plague set. But before we begin and show you the builds for the Plague set, let's make sure that we know what the Plague set does so that we know how the build functions. So starting off, looking at the set bonuses, two-piece set is each time, thank you Razor Synapse, that was so helpful. Each time that you consume a corpse, you fire a corpse lance at a nearby enemy. Four-piece set bonus is each time you hit with a bone spear, it reduces the damage that you take by 2% up to a maximum of 50%. And six-piece is each corpse you consume grants you an empowered bone spear charge that increases the damage of your next bone spear by 1000%. Now it should be noted that most of the builds for the Necromancer Plague set, I more or less think of it as a corpse lance build. Most of them focus pretty heavily on utilizing the corpse lances and draining blood to reduce cooldowns. There's one build variant that does a little bit less of that and focuses a bit more on the bone spear, and it's my favorite. It's also the one that I think has the most potential as we move into having necro-specific legendaries, and I will show you why in just a little bit. But that will be the last build that I showcase. We'll start off with the more popular ones, and then we'll move down from there. So if we're starting off with the most popular one, we actually would not have this one. We would be using this one, I believe, yes. I can't do it with skills on cooldown. Well, we'll look at the skill build I currently have equipped. So this build focuses on reducing your health through the Corpse Lance, Blood Lance, and by reducing your health, you're lowering your cooldowns with Blood is Power. Your left click, I have Land of the Dead. All corpse skills can be used at will for 10 seconds. Enemies in Land of Dead are periodically frozen. For my right click, I have Blood Spear, does increased damage but costs 10% health. That's 2 ticks of reduced cooldown from Blood is Power. So every time we fire off a Bone Spear, we're reducing our cooldown on our Land of the Dead, which is 120 seconds, by 2%. Pretty good. This is where the real cooldown reduction comes in though. Every Corpse Lance that fires off gives you 5% damage hit to your damage pool, which will reduce your cooldowns by 1% across the board. When we activate Land of the Dead and we combine that with our Devour, which will be constantly consuming corpses and an infinite supply of corpses through Land of the Dead, we basically have an infinite number of corpse lances consuming health and lowering our cooldowns. Now you can kill yourself with that, so we've counteracted that with some of our passives and some of our stat allocations. We're focusing heavily on life regen. This particular build is using Simulacrum. It's using a clone of yourself that if you would die, it would instead sacrifice the clone and fully heal you. It's basically a cheat death passive on steroids. In addition to that, it will also duplicate any blood spenders you use, so it will fire off bone spears as well, but those do not take away from your health like your own self-cast bone spears do. I also took Bone Armor Vengeful Ornaments because it gives you 30% damage reduction, which can help you survive random enemy hits, and more importantly, increases the damage you deal across the board to enemies by 15%. Devouring Aura is not in there so much for the aura aspect, just for the auto cast aspect. It will constantly be auto casting Devour. Now I did play around with trying Cannibalize since it restores more health, and then setting my Devour on an auto cast hotkey macro, which is legal in the game because it's built into the game itself. And it did work. It did fire off Devours constantly, but it did not let me fire off my Bone Spears because every time I fired off a Bone Spear, it would interfere with the Devour macro cast. So we can't do that. We have to go with Devouring Aura. So our passives are Blood is Power. Every 5% life loss will reduce remaining cooldowns by 1%. Draw Life increases your life regeneration by 10% for every enemy within 20 yards. Stand Alone will increase our armor by 100% because we're not having any allies. I don't believe this counts as an ally. If it does, it's 90%. And Consume Life, or Life from Death, gives basically health globes like mad whenever we activate Land of the Dead. In our equipment slots, we have Traveler's Pledge to give us cooldown, or give us damage reduction as well as damage increase. We have a Roger's Huge Stone because it will give us tons and tons of life regeneration, 98% life regeneration increase based on the amount of missing life. So basically the lower you dip, the higher your life generation goes, so you don't end up killing yourself. Our life generation right now is at 109,000 per second. As our health lowers, that will increase. And if we're standing in the middle of enemies, if you remember correctly, our passive draw life will increase our life generation by 10% for every enemy within 20 yards. Entirely feasible to double or even increase it more to 200, 300,000 life per second. One time I had it up to 500,000 life per second. It's pretty crazy. Molten Wildebeest Gizzard will increase our life regeneration by 63,000 per second and give us a 200% shield of our life regeneration when we don't take damage for 4 seconds. This will just help us absorb random pot shots here or there. We are grabbing Gem of Efficacious Toxin because it applies a toxin effect on enemies. That's kind of important, but the more important thing is it makes them take 10% increased damage from all sources and deal 10% less damage. We are taking the Pain Enhancer. It gives us a little bit of dot damage, which is okay, but more importantly, we're getting 3% increased attack speed for each enemy within 20 yards. It's bleeding. Critical hits cause bleeds. We have Nem Bracers on to spawn champion packs off of pylons. And we're going with Reinhardt because we're always going to have things frozen. So Reinhardt will have a chance to proc a 10,000 weapon damage hit on enemies whenever they're hit, 20% chance. They're getting hit all the time with this build, as you'll see in just a moment. And then offhand, we tried to get the best Phylactery we could. There are not any legendary Necromancer items in the game yet. Once there are, this build will change slightly. So let's just give a quick demonstration of how this build runs. We're just going to run out to Fields of Misery. We're going to do this for each of the builds just so you can see, and we'll go from there. Now remember which buttons I have on which. Alright, and here is where we activate our Land of the Dead, and we have Corpse Lances firing everywhere, as you can see. It's pretty crazy. Oh, I didn't show you what was in the cube. My bad. Alright, so we sacrificed our Simacrum because we took fatal damage there, but because of the cooldown reduction from Land of the Dead, by sacrificing all that health, it's already back up. And now we can just keep chaining Land of the Dead, keep chaining Simacrum, and constantly cycle through that by pumping out as much damage as we can, and basically keeping ourselves on the brink of death pretty consistently. The more often you can stand in the middle of more enemies, the better. You just gotta make sure that your health pool can stand it, and make sure you have your Simacrum, or your clone. I'm just gonna say clone from here on. Your clone is alive, that way you don't kill yourself accidentally. Alright, so this is a pretty powerful build. This is probably the most powerful of the variations. Another variation has a little bit less killing power, but a little bit more survivability, which we'll look at next. Let's just have a look in the cube real quick. Here you can see we have Cube, Furnace, Illusionary Boots to walk around easier, and Unity.
You know that you don't have to go back into the cube.
Oh yeah, I could, huh? Yep.
And scroll, we're done.
Alright. So, another build variant that we have on that is to instead swap out our Bone Armor for Blood Rush. And doing this actually allows us to drop the Illusionary Boots and switch over to Aquila Caress, which gives us quite a bit more damage reduction. Now, basically that means we have the mobility of a teleport and a bit more damage reduction, but we're losing the damage of the Bone Armor. So I look at it as the Bone Armor one's probably better for speed farming, versus this one is probably better for pushing rifts as high as we can. So we're just kind of go ahead and activate this. You can see, same kind of thing. We stay low on health the entire time while we're fighting enemies. It's not any different in that respect. Let's go ahead and spawn an elite here. So we just stay low on health pretty consistently with both builds, really. This one we have the mobility to jump out of crowd control things though, which is pretty important. Alright, so this is a build that is really, I think it's a bit more gear dependent. You need a lot of gear to make this work decently. One of the other builds we're going to show you is a little bit less gear dependent. but it's still fun. It's quite fun. This particular setup, I feel like I'm on the verge of death constantly. It kind of scares me a little bit. But as you can see, I'm not actually dying, so it doesn't really matter in the end, does it? In the end, nothing else matters. Alright, so that is that variant on the build. That is the one that Desolacer came up with, and is probably the most popular one. Same passives, same abilities, we just switched out Bone Armor for Potency. I prefer the Bone Armor variant for Bone Armor for Blood Rush with Potency. I prefer the Bone Armor variant, but that's just me. Alright, there's another variant. This is one that I've kind of come up with, tweaking some of the ideas here. This utilizes a curse. We're utilizing Leech with Osmosis, which increases our life regeneration for every target that's cursed. Now it's the same build otherwise, except that we swap out Draw Life for Exposed Weakness. This gives us a 1% damage increase for every enemy you have afflicted with Curse. We're also getting life per hit on those enemies, as well as life per second on those enemies. I believe it stacks up to 20 enemies, so it's a 20% damage increase, as well as quite a bit of survivability, which you'll see here. It feels a lot steadier, a lot more stable than the other build. So I personally like this one quite a bit better, but I can see the argument for both, for either. It does do a little bit less damage, but as you can see, my health isn't dipping nearly as much as it was with the other build, just because I'm keeping these guys cursed and keeping that life regeneration up on myself. It's not nearly as scary. Before, I was just practically almost killing myself constantly just with my corpse lances. And here, it's just not the case. I'm able to easily sustain, keep up at 2/3 or half life constantly, and be a lot steadier in what I'm doing. So, I like this variant a lot more, personally. Alright. Now, thank you. Yeah. There is another variant here, where we use Bone Armor. We drop Blood Rush, and we pick up Frailty with Volatile Death, which means they explode in the area around them. We also make sure we're using Exposed Weakness once again, and everything else is pretty much the same, except we have Bone Armor now. So, looking at the skill differences, we want to look at this one, right? Yeah. So we're losing Blood Rush. We're gaining Frailty. We're losing Simacrolum, which will self-heal us, and we're gaining Bone Armor. Now this one doesn't have the self-sustaining, self-healing that the Life Leech one I just showed you does. This one instead has more killing potential because Frailty, Volatile Death. But it is a bit more squished compared to the other one, as you'll see here. So we're in the same situation where we are with the regular, most popular build, in that we are living on the edge of death pretty consistently. But with this one, we don't actually have the passive that saves us through the Simacrolum, so if we die, we just die. So you have to be a little bit more careful. On the other hand, you also have the bonus of your Curse of Frailty can kill elites before they're actually ready to be dead. So that's pretty handy. Now, on to my favorite of the builds. It ventures a ways away from the Desolacer builds. Main purpose of using Simacrolum to focus and using Corpse Lances to deal damage. This one focuses more on your Bone Spears for doing damage. If you'll notice, I went with one-handed setups on all of these. On this one, I do not go with a one-handed setup. You also notice that the gems I was using for all the other sets are changed on this one as well. Alright, so let's go over the changes on this one, because this one's quite a bit different. Still the same set bonuses for the set. But now we're not using Traveler's Pledge anymore, we're using a Hellfire and a number of rings. So Hellfire Amulet with the Life from Death passive, so we can make sure we get those globes constantly. Our actual passives otherwise are Draw Life, which is giving us the health sustain, Exploit Weakness, which is giving us a damage boost, Standalone, which is giving us a damage reduction sustain, and Blood for Power, which is giving us cooldown. In our cube, we are using a Convention of Elements, Aquila Caress, and Furnace. For our rings, we're using Roger's Huge Stone and a Unity. So you can already see we have a ton more survivability than we do with the other builds. We have lots and lots of damage reduction with the Aquila Crest. We're able to slot in a Unity. We have a huge damage boost from our Convention of Elements, which only cycles through 3 elements on Necromancer. It's pretty nice. And then we have our extra passive through Hellfire Amulet, so we essentially have 5 passives. We have Life from Death, we have Draw Life, Exploit Weakness, Standalone, and Blood for Power. Good combinations. I took a Witching Hour on the belt for increased attack speed. And then we're going with the Nemesis Bracers, although I was running Reaper's Wraps most of the time. So we'll kind of show you what this looks like in a Rift. Oh, the actual build, we took Blood Rush with Metabolism for 2 teleports instead of 1, but we sacrificed 10% health. Not a big deal because we heal it up instantly with our massive life regeneration. For gems, we still have our Molten Wildebeest Gizzard, but now we have a Bane of the Trapped and a Bane of the Stricken. More traditional gems for current Greater Rifts. This build, I think, will scale much better than the other builds once you have the Necromancer-specific legendaries. Frozen Lands of Dead, still always a good choice. But our Bone Spear is no longer a Blood Spear. Now it's Bone Spear Shatter. It will detonate for 450 damage to all enemies within 15 yards. Remember, our set also boosts the damage quite a bit of Bone Spear, so this is why this build is relying a lot more on Bone Spear. We AoE down packs, and we have Frailty with Volatile Death on those packs, so that when they hit 15% damage, they explode like a Monk's Exploding Palm, and deal 100% weapon damage to enemies around them. This is why we're using the two-handed weapon instead of a one-handed weapon. We want those explosions to hurt enemies more to get more value from it. In my testing, I found that the two-handed variant performed better than the one-handed variant. Still Blood Lance, still Devouring Aura to keep our Frozen Lands of Dead up. Yeah, so let's just kind of show you how it works. So one of the big things is making sure we have packs of enemies kited together. Okay, we want to freeze them when they're in the best position possible, so that we can make sure that we get value out of detonations. And one of the things that's interesting here is we want to be within the range of them whenever possible, because we'll get more life regen, and we can also make sure that we are detonating them in the right spot. So we want to make sure that we are detonating our Bone Spears to have maximum splash potential, which is where the double teleport comes in, but we also want to be using our Oculus Rift whenever possible. So it's kind of a balance between our Oculus Rift, or our Oculus Ring rather, and making sure that we're getting the best angle for our Bone Spear to detonate on as many enemies as possible. So, make sure you have your curse up and then blow things up, is the main idea. Now I think this set is going to scale better than the other ones once we have our Necromancer specific legendaries, because a number of them focus on Bone Spear, increasing the effectiveness of Bone Spear. And the set itself seems to want to lean towards Bone Spear rather than Corpse Lance. Like, Corpse Lance is a 2-piece bonus. Bone Spear is a 6-piece bonus. If they didn't want Bone Spear to be the central focus of the set, they wouldn't have done that. And that's, I mean, sets can change and everything, but that's kind of my thought process there. Now, you can see it clears out pretty good. You didn't see the other ones in a Rift, but it's about the same clear speed. It's actually a little bit quicker. I cleared with this set about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes quicker on Greater Rift 45 than I did with the Desolacer set. So I like this one more for that reason. It feels smoother, it feels more survivable, it clears AoE packs a lot better. Overall, it just feels a lot better. So let's look at what those weapons that I was talking about are. Now, they're not all actually in the game yet, but some of them are. So the one-handers say power not implemented yet, but when we start looking at the Phylacteries, we have some interesting ideas here. Skeletal Mage lasts an additional 1 second. Cool. When an exploded corpse damages at least one enemy, your corpse explosion deals 100% damage for 6 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. I can't wait for that to be put into the game because I have a build in mind that's going to work so good with that. But here we have Necromancer minions have 100% chance to apply a random curse on hit. Obviously that's made for the follower build. Bone Spear now costs 40 essence and deals 100% increased damage. So this is the reason why I think this build will scale better than the other builds, because we are increasing the damage by 1000% on the Bone Spear, but we're also doubling it before that applies. I would assume it doubles before it applies. So instead of hitting for 450%, it's going to hit for 900% and then be increased by 1000%. It's going to hit like a truck. It's going to cost a little bit more essence, but that's not going to matter because we're going to have constant essence with Land of the Dead and Devour Aura. So that alone is going to make this build outscale the popular build for the Plague set that Desolacer showcased. Bone Spikes, Bone Spear, and Bone Spear deal 100% damage against enemies that are frozen, stunned, charmed, feared, or blinded. So I see this used in combination with this. So instead of using a two-hander, we would probably... Oh, this is a two-hander. So we would probably use this on our, like, in our weapon slot, because it's going to give us that 200 damage that we want for this build. And then we would cube this. We're going to be giving up Furnace, but that's not a big deal because this is a way better bonus anyway. So these two legendaries, once they're implemented, hopefully next week, I think are going to make this build that I'm showcasing right now way, way better. This is kind of interesting too. Yeah. So I think that this is going to be, these two legendaries are going to make a big difference as far as making this build viable. I think this build will be very, very viable. It already clears Greater Rift 45 within the time limit, which is the Greater Rift level that is the leaderboards.
That is not possible.
I actually just got some keys. I guess I could show that. I was gonna say I don't have any keys, but I just went and ran a T6 and got some keys. Which, by the way, this build is fantastic for speed clearing T6 because of the Frailty Curse. You just blow shit up. And right now, with the current level of the Necromancer's power, T6 is kind of what I'm farming to get my Greater Rift gems. Just because it's quick and it's effective. But you can see here at T10, which is Greater Rift 45, we're doing just fine. We're not having any trouble surviving. We're not having any trouble killing things. We're kind of jumping around, pulling together big packs of enemies. And then when we've got them kind of gathered up, we will go ahead and activate our Land of the Dead and then just blow them up. Right here. I just want to get inside that Oculus. And then boom. Now it's not like instant or anything, but for this set, I think it's probably the best performing variant of this set. Just because it has high mobility, high survivability, high damage, and it focuses on the thing that the Legendary set is clearly supposed to focus on, which is the Bone Spear. It also uses a Plague Rune, or a rune that has like a Plague effect on it. It says it's physical, but it has like a Plague effect. So it feels like it's kind of what was meant for this build. And yeah, it's pretty cool. I like it a lot. So those are the basic builds for a Plague set Necromancer. As far as I see it, those are pretty much the main ones that you can make work. I tried one that didn't focus on using Corpse Lance at all, and tried to get enough cooldown reduction through Gorgok and gear to make it work with Land of the Dead, and use a different thing other than Corpse Lance, Blood Lance. Just wasn't able to make it work. I could get within 1 second downtime, but it just felt too clunky. There were too many too many moving parts to make work for it to be kind of efficient and a good build. I really wanted it to work, but it just wasn't. So yeah, this build is a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying it, and it will be the last one I try out until they put the Corpse Explosion builds into the game for this set. Once they have the Corpse Explosion legendaries into the game, this set's going to have even more possibilities, because you could go with something with like Corpse Explosion Close Quarters combined with Land of the Dead and Devour Aura, and it's going to give me some interesting stuff. I'll kind of show you what I mean by that in just a second. I'm just going to pop out of this. We're not going to finish clearing this. You guys get the idea on how it works. So those are the main builds. The one thing that we could look at doing if we are going to have the legendaries that increase Corpse Explosion is, instead of Devour Aura, we could go with Corpse Explosion with Close Quarters. And then when we activate our Land of the Dead, we can spam our R. And that's going to be some interesting stuff happening. Now, it's not optimized for this build by any means, but You can kind of see what I mean. You're going to spam R and do constant corpse explosions. Now we can't weave in bone spears though while we do this, is the downside. So, But there's a legendary that unleashes a death nova every time you corpse explosion. So that's going to work really well with this particular set. It's just not in the game yet, but when it gets put into the game, it's going to make a big difference for that style play. Corpse explosion deals 100% increased damage, stacking up to 6 times. Boom, that's huge. So we use that in our regular offhand, and then we also go with, where's that? After consuming 1 corpse, you unleash a free death nova. It's going to be really good with that as well. So look for those two to make an interesting build in the future when they're implemented into the game. For now, those are all the builds that we can really use with Necromancer. Once they introduce the Necromancer specific legendaries, I'll be revisiting this particular set because I really like it. I think it has a lot of potential, but for now, that's kind of where we're at. Alright guys, I'm going to end this live stream right here because I want this to be more or less just a build guide video, but stick around. I'm going to be going live again in like 2.5–3 minutes, and I will be testing out one of the other sets, and I will take requests from you guys. If you have any requests for specific sets, go ahead and type it into the live chat and we'll test whichever set you want because we have the blood shards ready to purchase it from the vendor. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope the set guide was helpful for you, and make sure to like, favorite, share, and subscribe. Later, YouTube. See you in a few minutes.